fellow clinicians. This is me, Ali Nisse, and I'm here at the Vancouver, British Columbia, attending a conference here, the dental conference, Pacific Dental Conference, a beautiful conference in the beautiful city, obviously. I love Vancouver. And I had an interesting course today. It was a morning and an afternoon. Of course, I missed the morning session because of the crazy snowstorm that was going on in the Boston area, but I had an afternoon session, which is a hands-on. And there was one area during the hands-on that I wanted to discuss, and I never got a chance to mention it. So this video is for those folks from the Vancouver hands-on course, and it's about the difference between crown down technique versus the step back. Now it's an important one, so hang in there. Okay, so I've come inside now, and in the protection of my hotel room here at the Fairmont, across the street from the convention hall, had a great presentation with a nice group of people here in Canada today in Vancouver. And the area that I wanted to kind of embellish on, and in fact add a little bit more information on, was the difference between the crown down technique and the step back technique. Of course, most people don't realize that there is a distinction that was made in the endodontics field in these two areas many years ago. Originally, when root canal therapy was developed, the technique of choice was the step back technique. The idea was that you actually rush to the apex with your small size files, and then you serially enlarge to a larger size file. And then once you had achieved your master apical file, then you would start to step back and create a flare. And this concept was used the entire era of hand instrumentation. Towards the later part of hand instrumentation, it wasn't until the 1980s where people such as Montgomery and even Goerig and those guys started to talk about the concept of crown down technique. And what this technique had in contrast to the step back, the idea was that you actually introduced the larger size files into the root canal first, and your aim wasn't to achieve apex at the beginning, but rather to serially step down in size from the largest to the smallest size files, and in the process remove dentin coronally as you move down towards the apex. So this allowed for removal of that restricted kind of dentin that is kind of creates most of the obstacles for you to reach length at the beginning. Treat the upper half of the canal separately from the bottom half, and then have a better chance of negotiating around curves and all kinds of different anatomy at the apex. And I think it's a very important concept that we all have to keep in mind, and for that reason I think I should probably explain a little bit more by going to the board. Okay, what we want to do is we want to compare two instrumentation techniques, one being the conventional step back technique and the other being the crown down technique. Now, step back technique originally, as I mentioned, was basically developed by doctors Wine and Walton and so on back many years ago in the 70s, and even maybe first described in the 60s. That was the original hand instrumentation technique. The idea was that you would get down to the apex first, and then you would enlarge the space until you achieved a master apical file, and then you came back up and you flared incrementally. This technique was actually improved by Dr. Torabinejad through a passive step back technique, and that actually made a lot of sense, but we're not going to get into that right now. Crown down technique was further explained by Drs. Goerig and then later on by Morgan and Montgomery in the early 80s, and what basically that idea was, it was kind of the opposite of the step back. So if we think of two identical canals, for example, let's say we have two canals that are identical. Forgive if my hand drawing is not actually making them identical, but let's assume that these are all about a 1001 or a 1001 type of a canal. Okay, so a 1001 canal is a fairly thin and small canal, which means that if you put a 1002 hand file, it starts to bind up on top and it's going to have a hard time achieving apex. You're going to have to instrument it. You have to use some watch winding motion or balance force motion or whatever is your preferred motion to work the file down to the apex. So what you're going to do, you have two options to instrument these canals. In one option, which is the step back technique, you work the 10 to the apex, and then you get a 1002, which means that you're going to actually get a little bit more enlargement. So now you have a 1002 canal. And then what you're going to do is you're going to move
down incrementally and now get a 1502, which is going to enlarge the canal a little bit more, and then a 2002, and then a 2502, and so on and so forth, let's say until you get it to a 3002. So now you have gone from a first file that is binding here, which would be, let's say, a 10 of 15, you've gone up 3 files, and you have achieved this kind of a look. Now you may add a few additional taper to the top by going larger, and now you have your final shape. Now, as you can see here, what ends up happening with this technique is that all your files are at all time contacting the dentin throughout the entire length of the canal. So each file is basically getting a lot of engagement, and during the moving down process, each file has to reach the apex as it's scraping. And what ends up happening is, if you just make a little inset here of this process, as each file that's in the canal is actually making contact with the walls, it's going to create this debris. And this debris is going to move ahead of the file. It's going to come down, and it can potentially starts to clog the canal. And this file is going to act like a piston that is going to pack it, which is why procedural errors used to happen so often with the step back technique, especially with the hand filing, because of this packing of the debris. And if you had a vital tooth, it was even more, because you also had the vital tissue and all the collagen that would also add to the packing process, and you would end up instrumenting, and you had a tooth that you were instrumenting to was a 22 millimeter canal, let's say, and you were instrumenting, and all of a sudden you were left at a 20 millimeter length because the last 2 millimeters were packed, and then you would oftentimes end up calling that a calcified tooth. But that was not the case. The problem was the fact that debris was not easily managed in this type of a step back process. So later on, the idea was, well, what if instead of having this type of a step back where we're trying to reach the apex right away and then enlarge incrementally to achieve a master file, why don't we do the opposite? So here, let's say what we've done is we've gone from a size 15 to the apex, and then to a 20, and then a 30, and then that was, that's pretty much it. But now, why don't we do the opposite? Why don't we try to have an orifice opener, and then do a 30, and then a 25, and then a 20, and if needed, a 15? Because what it turns out, most of the time, our instruments are actually binding more up on the top than they are binding at the apical area. So if we can remove some of these coronal restrictions by using an orifice opener first, so that we can actually enlarge the coronal half of the canal. And if we treat the canal, if you will, in 2 separate areas, let's just say that if this is the canal, we're going to divide it in half. We're going to call the top part a coronal half and the bottom part the apical half. So if we use an orifice opener and enlarge up to the middle half of the tooth, and then a size 30, and a 30, because it has a smaller taper, is going basically to create this type of a shape. Now we're left with basically the apical third of the root that we can move to a size 25. And then most of the time, the 20 will actually reach the apex, because surprisingly, most canals where it feels tight at the beginning to a size 10 or 15 hand file, it's not because the hand file is binding up at the tip, but it's actually binding up high. And by having this incremental stepping down or crown down technique, what we're doing is we're removing those restrictions from the top, and so that each file, as you can see, the first orifice opener is binding this much, the 30 is binding this much, the 25 is binding this much, the 20 is binding this much, because the rest of it is actually free, because the previous file created some space. And then, if needed, then we put the 15 in. And now we're finally at the apex. And oftentimes, if you have these handpieces that have an orifice opener, all you need is just a size 10 to just validate the space that you have. And then as you crown down carefully using the rhythm motion, and I will talk about these things in a future tutorial, you're able to not block yourself, remove the debris up coronally, as you move down so that you don't keep packing debris. In this technique, you end up pushing a lot of debris out the apex, and that could cause post-op pain. In this technique, you're removing the debris as you are moving down. And therefore, the amount of debris generation is minimized because the debris is being removed as you're moving down. So here, once then you reach the 20 or the 15 reaches the apex, now what you can do is you could do another round of coming down, if you will, and this time the 30 is going to move down more, like that, and then the 25 is going to reach the apex, and then another last round, the 30 is going to reach the apex. Or if you prefer, you can move back up, and then 15 is to the apex, get the 20 to the apex, and get the 25 to the apex, and then get the 30 to the apex. So instead of coming down to the apex and enlarging 10 to 15 to 20 to 30, what we've done is we've come from 30 down to 25, down to 20, and then to 15. And then you have two options. You can start again from a 30 and come down until you just do cycles, which is something that I've talked about in the past. Or what you could do is it might be easier for you to remember to just go back up then one file at a time until you go back to 30. So you're crowning down, and then you're moving back up. And what happens at the end, when you get the 30 down to the apex, then it blends everything in the same shape that this other guy here with the step back was the same shape that it was created in. This is the crown down. So you're ultimately getting the same shape as a final product. So what is the difference, you might say? Well, if it's the same shape, obviously there's, a million different ways to skin the cat. Why should I do crown down instead of step back? Well, as I mentioned, the benefits of crown down compared to step back is the fact that you create less debris along the way, since you remove the debris every time that your file is meeting resistance and you remove it from the canal, as opposed to trying to go all the way to the apex at each setting. You're doing incremental removal and irrigation, so the top of the canal is clean, and by the time you reach the apex, you've removed all of those coronal debris so that you minimize the amount, so there's less debris extrusion. Okay? And that's one of the main benefits of the crown down. Furthermore, because the file is not contacting across the whole length of the file, you are also reducing your odds of procedural errors that used to happen all the time with stainless steel files, such as zipping and ledging and all kinds of things. The only key, however, with the crown down is that you have to use a passive force. You're not supposed to force any of the files down. You have to let each one of these 30 and then 25 and 20 and 15 just do a little bit of cutting. So that's what we call the rhythm motion, and I will describe that in more detail when I talk about the advanced endosequence and ESX blend protocol in a future tutorial. But I just want you to know that there is this significant difference between doing step back, which is the traditional way that endodontic therapy and instrumentation and the kinematics of hand motion has been taught in schools, and the crown down, which on the face of it appears to be a more advanced protocol, but it's not actually. It's less prone to errors if you just pay attention to this idea of a passive movement of instruments from a larger size to the smaller size until apex is reached, and then incrementally enlarging from that point on. So that's a really important key point to keep in mind for differentiation between the step back and the crown down. As I mentioned before, I'm going to soon do another video where I go into more detail about advanced instrumentation with the crown down using this blended protocol of ESX and some of the newer files that are now available to you guys.
Okay, as you saw, there are specific advantages for the crown down technique over the step back technique. Of course, both techniques are valid techniques for instrumentation, and many people have preferences for one versus the other, some of which has to do with habit and the way they were trained. But in my opinion, and of course I'm biased because that's the technique that I use, the crown down has significant advantages over the step back in terms of reducing procedural errors. It has its own set of concepts that you need to heed and pay attention to so that you don't cause any potential problems with the crown down technique. But overall, crown down, in my opinion, is much more predictable in terms of instrumentation protocols and techniques. And that's why I've been using it, and I've had the great benefit of having utilized this technique successfully over the years in my career. So I will have more videos to get in more detail and demonstrate these concepts to you in the future. And in the meantime, for Vivaldindo, I'm Ali Nisse. Let's save some tea.